Hello YouTube! So there is a new philpapers survey out. I've already answered it, but then it occurred to me I should have recorded myself giving the answers. I've already got a video up of me going through the old philpapers survey. That was the one from 2009 and giving my responses to that. But this new one has a whole bunch of new questions on it. So yeah, I just thought I would make this video where I go through it, just in case there was anybody who was interested to know my positions on all these new topics. I'm going to proceed quite quickly through some of these questions, just because, as I say, I've already got a video where I answer the 2009 survey, so there's not really much point explaining my answers again. But okay then, let's go. So the first question, the aim of philosophy. So I think this is kind of a silly question. Why should we suppose that philosophy as a whole has an aim? Individual philosophers have aims, and maybe it also makes sense to attribute aims to particular research groups or even particular research traditions. Like, I guess it's sensible to talk as if the logical positivists as a whole had certain aims. You know, and that's because the logical positivists were a bunch of individual philosophers who all adopted broadly similar goals and methods. So we might say, okay, the logical positivists aimed to eliminate metaphysics, or they aimed to make philosophy part of the scientific enterprise, or they aimed to show that philosophical problems could be dissolved with linguistic analysis, and so on, right? So in that kind of case, all right, it's sensible to talk about aims, but I really don't know how to even think about the aim of philosophy in general, right? Like, if we're just thinking of the whole sweep of philosophical history and all of the different philosophical traditions in all the different countries, I mean, I don't think it really makes sense to attribute an aim to that discipline. I mean, and actually, part of the problem here is that so the boundaries between philosophy and other disciplines are extremely vague, right? Like you go back a few hundred years and there isn't at all such a clear boundary between philosophy and natural science in the way that there is now. So it's like, what philosophy is, it's difficult to even state that. So how can you state what the aim of it is? So yeah, I just say, well, there is no fact of the matter for this one, and that's my answer to that. Okay, knowledge, rationalism or empiricism. Obviously I'm an empiricist, and I just recently uploaded a video where I talk about empiricism, and specifically stance empiricism, which has been developed by Van Frassen, so you should go and watch that video. Metaethics, realism or anti-realism. Obviously anti-realist. Material composition, nihilism, restrictivism or universalism. So material composition, this is a question about the conditions under which two objects compose a further object. So when do you have a composite object? For instance, I'm currently looking at my computer. My computer intuitively seems to be a composite object. It is a single thing, but it is composed of lots of different parts. So it's composed of a screen and of a keyboard, and then the keyboard is itself composed of different parts because it has different keys, and so on. So you have all of these different parts, and they have come together into a single object. Now, nihilism is the view that actually two different material objects never compose a further object. So according to the nihilist, all that actually exists are I think they use the phrase mereological simples, right? They're like literally just fundamental particles. That's it. And you never get objects. Even in the case of something like a computer, it's just a, you know, collection of particles arranged in this particular shape, right? But there isn't a single object there. Universalism is the view that for any two objects, those compose a further object. So not only do we have composite objects like this computer, it's also the case that, like, the left half of this computer and the right half of the Andromeda galaxy those compose an object, right? Like, so any two objects you want to name compose a further object. So composition is unrestricted according to the universalist. And obviously restrictivism is, I guess, the common sense position that some objects compose further objects and some don't. Composition occurs, but it is restricted. So yeah, I mean, I guess my official line on this is going to be: there's just no facts to the matter, right? Like, this is, as far as I'm concerned, it's purely a pragmatic issue about, you know, what is the best way of carving up, you know, the world, right? Given our goals, given our, I don't know, general, like, background beliefs, given our theoretical perspective, given what we're trying to achieve, etc. It's purely pragmatic. I mean, for the vast majority of circumstances, it's going to be some sort of restrictivism. You know, if you're say wanting to move house and you need to take an inventory of the number of objects in your house, obviously under that sort of context, the compositional relations that you're assuming, so the way in which different objects compose further objects, is going to be restricted, and it's going to be vague and messy, right? Like, there isn't going to be necessary and sufficient conditions for when two objects compose a further object. And so the thing is that, yeah, in the vast majority of cases, it's going to be some sort of restrictivism. I guess you can get nihilism or universalism if you develop some sort of, like, formal logical theory of part-whole relations. But I just don't see any reason to suppose that formal theory captures, you know, the real part-whole relations, or captures the real composition relations. I don't think there are any such things. No, it's just pragmatic, I think. Yeah, so that's material composition. Science, realism or anti-realism. I'm an anti-realist. Proper names, Reagan or Millian. I lean towards Reaganism. And naturalism or non-naturalism, I just think that's totally unclear. Cosmological fine-tuning. Well, I mean, I don't think there's any reason to believe that there is fine-tuning. So, you know, as I see it, so first of all, as I have just said in response to question number 5, I'm an anti-realist, just in general, right, about scientific theories. So my line on this is just going to be, look, fine-tuning is a feature of the theories, not a feature of the world itself. There's just no reason to think that, like, the world itself is somehow fine-tuned. But, you know, even if I were a scientific realist about this, so cosmological fine-tuning is going to be things like, if the strong nuclear force were, like, you know, 1% different, then nothing like our universe, or no universe capable of supporting life, could have come into existence. Or maybe, like, the universe would have just collapsed immediately, or something like that. Okay, so fair enough. So that then looks like there's fine-tuning. It looks like there's a very narrow range of possibilities available, right? At least if you want to have a universe capable of supporting life. But that's the case if you focus specifically on that one thing, so on, say, the strong nuclear force. But then, what if you were to alter the strong nuclear force, but also alter a bunch of other factors, like, you know, gravitational constant, right? Would that, you know, so if you altered the strong nuclear force by something, and then you altered the gravitational constant as well, you know, if you're altering two things, is that, how do you judge whether or not that is going to come out as being fine-tuned? Because Do you see what I mean? Right, because obviously if you hold, say, the gravitational constant fixed, or at least if you hold all of these other factors fixed and you change the strong nuclear force, then okay, the universe doesn't come into existence or it collapses immediately or something. But if you change the strong nuclear force and you allow changes in these other factors, how can you even make any judgment about what would happen to the state of the universe? I'm not sure about that. So yeah, I think even if I were a scientific realist, I'd be at least skeptical of claims of fine-tuning. But as I say, I'm not a realist. I think that yeah, fine-tuning is just a feature of the models. So I would say there is no fine-tuning. Eating animals and animal products. Yeah, I think that's morally acceptable. I'm not moved by animal welfare arguments. I'm concerned about the environment, and I think that a very, very easy way of reducing environmental impact would be to reduce meat consumption. So I'm all in favour of encouraging people to stop eating meat and to stop, just in general consuming animal products. That would be positive, but I cannot bring myself to say that it's morally wrong, because the simple fact is that yes, one, in my opinion, very easy way of reducing environmental impact is to reduce meat consumption, but there are other ways of reducing one's environmental impact as well. I mean, there are countless ways of doing it. So, for example, just not having kids, right? So a meat eater who does not reproduce will have a far lower impact on the environment than a vegan who does reproduce. So that's the problem, right? We all have some sort of environmental impact, and there are many ways of reducing it. And so I can't say that the environmental argument pushes me to say that this is morally wrong. But look, I don't really care. I mean, to be honest, if the meat industry were just like eradicated tomorrow, I would probably improve the world. Personal identity, yep, no. Fact of the matter. Knowledge claims, I am a relativist. Propositional attitudes, representational, non-existent, phenomenal, or dispositional. I have no idea. I don't know this debate at all. I mean, I'm aware of parts of the debate, right? Like I know eliminativism, and that would be the claim that propositional attitudes are non-existent, but these other positions, I'm not sure. I guess dispositionalism, that sounds like a kind of behaviorism, maybe. Yeah, I just don't know. So I'm going to move on. Yeah. Grounds of intentionality. Again, I don't know. I don't know this debate well enough to say. Mental content. Yep, no facts of the matter. Footbridge. So you got a man on the bridge, 5 people on the track below. Should you push the man off the bridge or not? Well, I mean, look. Personally, I wouldn't push him. Right? That's yeah. I'm not keen on on that thought. But I don't really care what you do. It's up to you. If you want to push him, you go ahead. I don't think that there's anything you ought to do. Maybe I should change my answer. I've put don't push, but then it does say what ought one do. So maybe, yeah. Maybe I should say something else here. Like okay then. I'll just reject both, shall I? Because so I wouldn't push him, but I don't think there is an obligation either way. Either way. Yeah. I don't much care what others choose to do. But I don't feel there is. Put feel rather than think. Feel. Yeah, there we go. Laws of nature, Humean moral judgment, non-cognitivist. Logic, yeah, I reject both in the sense that, so obviously both of these logics, classical logics and non-classical logics, have plenty of useful applications. But I take it the question here is, which of these provides the correct account of reasoning? And I don't think there is such a thing as, correct reasoning. So I reject both in that sense. Perceptual experience, I'm just not familiar enough with this. I mean, my understanding of the debate about perception is, I think, about 50 years behind where current philosophy is. I've got some videos actually on perception that I did a long time ago on representationalism, direct realism, idealism, and I'm a direct realist. But the thing is, it doesn't actually say direct realism here. I mean, I know that disjunctivism is a type of direct realism, but I think there are other ways of being a direct realist, and so I wouldn't want to necessarily commit myself to that. Maybe I'm wrong though. Maybe, yeah, no, it doesn't matter. I'm not familiar enough with this, at least not anymore, to give an answer. Truth, yeah, I have correspondence intuitions, but I accept an epistemic view. Again, I'm going through some of these quickly because I talk about a lot of them in the previous video. Like I talked about this one in the previous video, and I want to say more about this. I want to explain my position, but there's just no point because I've got that other video, and I may as well just carry on through this. So, race, biological, social, or unreal. So I've selected unreal here. Okay, so one thing I'm sure of is that there are no races in the traditional sense, in what I'm calling the traditional sense. The traditional view of race is incorrect. That's just not a useful way of taxonomizing human populations. Look, we can certainly talk about different populations for various purposes. Population genetics has all kinds of useful applications. There are all sorts of situations in which it's useful to distinguish different human populations, but there are various different ways of drawing those lines. There may well be very limited contexts where dividing populations in line with traditional races is useful, but it's going to be a classification more like blood type, for example. Yes, in the context of giving blood transfusions, it's useful to divide people up by blood type, and maybe you can also find some other correlations. I saw a study the other day which suggested that people with different blood types have different outcomes with respect to COVID-19. So, there's a situation where blood type is of significance, but the traditional view, right, that we have these kind of continental groupings with a number of significant properties that distinguish them, I think that's just obviously false. Now, when it comes to the debate between social or unreal, maybe there's not much of a difference here, right? So there is, I guess, a sense in which race clearly is socially constructed, because there's just no doubt that racial categories have been constructed. Laws like apartheid and the Jim Crow laws and things like that, social structures which oppress people or discriminate people on grounds of their racial classification, that will lead to significant differences in populations along racial lines. So, if you look at America under the Jim Crow laws, then you can see a clear division between white people and black people. But that division is a product of the social environment. So you might say, okay, well, maybe there are these races, but they've been socially constructed. But I mean, the question there is just whether you want to say that that's a race. And it seems to me that, given the traditional use of the term race, where this is supposed to designate different biological groupings, like, you know, as I say, these broad continental groupings with different like ancestries and with significantly different properties as a result of biological factors. Given the fact that that's how racial taxonomies were used, and given how loaded the idea of race is, given the problematic associations with it, I don't think there's really much to be gained in, you know, reinterpreting the term. So I'm just going to say unreal. That's why I at least lean toward that. Maybe I should put lean toward. Yeah. Okay. Free will, compatibilist. Aesthetic value, subjective. Analytic, synthetic, no. Experience machine, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, I would get into the experience machine. So, first of all, then, like, what is it that we value, right? What is it that we value, if not what we experience? Or maybe I should not say we, I should say I. I'm just talking about myself here. And this is just a question about me. It just says, would you enter? Yes, I would enter. So what is it that I value, if not what I experience? Well, I do value other things, right? I mean, I value other people. I take myself to, in some sense, have obligations to others. But, you know, what obligations do I actually have to others? Not much. Nobody is dependent on me to that great of an extent, and even if there was somebody who was dependent, who was like really dependent on me, I don't think I would have an obligation to do anything for them. So as far as I'm concerned, nobody has any obligation to continue existing. I think suicide is entirely morally acceptable and sometimes quite reasonable, and that's even if you are, you know, young, healthy, you know, good life prospects, rich, well-educated, whatever. You know, even under the best of circumstances, I think it is perfectly morally acceptable for you to just commit suicide. Even if there are like loads of people depending on you to continue existing, no, I think it's fine for you to commit suicide. So if it's fine to commit suicide, it's got to be fine to just get in the experience machine, and yeah, then you wouldn't have. So yeah, like the fact that I have obligations to others is not relevant here, and actually, of course, that's not relevant to the point that Robert Nozick was originally making with this thought experiment. But I think it's just worth mentioning, because obligations to others is one of the main reasons, in my experience, why people say they wouldn't get in. Okay, so here's the more important point about this. There's an assumption underlying this thought experiment that the experience machine creates a fake world, like a dream world. But why should we accept this? So my inclination is to think that actually no, the world of the experience machine, the world like in the experience machine, is a real world, just as real as this one. It just happens to have, let's say, an alternative metaphysics. So like in the experience machine, there really are like, you know, objects, and you know, there really are cars and trees and people. It's just that the underlying metaphysical nature of those things is, you know, different to what it is in this world, or at least presumably different. I mean, for all I know or care, maybe I'm actually already in an experience machine. Like, it's possible, it's logically possible that this world that I'm currently occupying is, on a metaphysical level, a simulation of some sort. I mean, a lot of people actually take this quite seriously, the idea that, you know, the universe is a simulation. I don't see any reason to take this seriously, right? But it's logically possible. And if it were true, I wouldn't care. And I wouldn't conclude, oh, well, it turns out the world doesn't exist. No, no, there's still a computer in front of me. There's still a cup on the table. There are still lots of other people that I interact with. It's just the underlying metaphysics is somewhat surprising. But I'm an empiricist. I don't buy into metaphysics anyway. We don't know the underlying structure of reality anyway. So getting into the experience machine is not a case of getting into a fake world or a dream world or anything like that. It's just, different from this world. I mean, for me, this question is almost like, would you move to another country if that country somehow would give you everything you want and just produce endless joy? Well, yes, absolutely. I would do that. I would move to another country under those circumstances. So why not move to another world in order to achieve the same thing? To get whatever you want and have endless joy. So yeah, I would get in. I absolutely, 100% would get into the experience machine. Philosophical progress. Yeah, so I am inclined to say that there is a little bit of philosophical progress. I mean, I think there are some fairly obvious cases where philosophers have made progress. So I think there is genuine progress with respect to clarifying questions, clarifying the relations between different positions. So sort of just in general, I think there is progress in exploring the conceptual landscape. Philosophers are very good at working out the logical relations between positions and drawing important distinctions and so on. Like we're good at that, and we've made progress in that. I also think that there's progress in terms of what we might call conceptual engineering. We are very good at taking the confused, vague, incoherent concepts of ordinary thought and ordinary language, and then kind of seeing and then sort of making them better, as it were, right? Explicating them, constructing better concepts which have more theoretical power, or which are more coherent out of those vague concepts. So if you take something like free will, I think that in everyday thought, the concept of free will is just kind of vague and incoherent. But through philosophical analysis, we've worked out a bunch of coherent ways of conceiving of free will. And I would say that something like compatibilism, or at least some sort of compatibilism, probably provides the best way of thinking about free will. So we've taken this confused concept and we've made something clear and precise, and something which maybe has some theoretical utility. So philosophers are good at all of this type of stuff, and I think there's been genuine progress in these respects. So why do I say only a little rather than a lot? Well, it's just because there are huge areas of philosophy that, as far as I'm concerned, are deeply mistaken. Well, not just deeply mistaken, but deeply misguided in terms of the very questions they ask and the methods that they employ to answer those questions. There are huge areas of philosophy that are not even wrong. Look, I've mentioned I'm an empiricist. Obviously, I think that a lot of metaphysics goes very wrong in terms of the way that it proceeds. By the types of questions it asks and the methods it has for answering those questions, the way that metaphysicians proceed by explaining things via postulating entities that exist beyond what could be found in experience. I think that's very misguided, that kind of explanation by postulation. There are large areas of philosophy that are misguided in this way, and also there's just a huge amount of philosophical disagreement on the central basic questions, and I don't think there's really much chance of there being any real convergence in the future on these questions. The basic questions of philosophy. There are debates that were going on 2,000 years ago that are still going on now, and maybe there are more modern debates that just don't seem to have any chance of being resolved. Where philosophy does exhibit convergence, I think that's often more a result of like, you know, fashion or bandwagoning than it is a matter of people coming to accept like the justified beliefs, or at least it's more a result of fashion bandwagoning than people presenting rationally compelling arguments. So, you know, something like the convergence on physicalism is... I don't think that's anywhere close to being justified. I think there are serious problems with physicalism as a metaphysical thesis, but there's been a huge convergence on it. I'm not convinced that that convergence is going to be maintained indefinitely. As I say, I think that's more a kind of fashion thing. So for those reasons, I would say that there's a little philosophical knowledge, right? So yeah, we make progress in some ways, but there's not a lot. Of course, this is maybe a difficult question to answer because there aren't really strict distinctions between the disciplines. Philosophy is just a useful way of capturing those areas of inquiry that you know, are maybe more conceptual, not amenable to empirical investigation, whatever. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, go back into history, there were different ways of drawing the lines between what was philosophy and what wasn't, and you know, maybe on you know, broader conceptions there actually has been quite a lot of progress, but I'm going to say a little. Time, well, I'm obviously agnostic about that. Mind, yep, not a physicalist. God, atheist. Time travel, well, I have no idea. You know, again, this is just a product of my general anti-realism about science, my general rejection of metaphysics. The meaning of life. It's an interesting question, this one. Like, I was struck when I saw this. I thought, okay, why is this here? Is this something that a lot of philosophers care about? I mean, this is one of those things where it seems like a lot of laypersons think that the meaning of life is a philosophical question, right? But I don't know if... I have very rarely encountered professional philosophers talking about this, but maybe that's just a product of my educational background in philosophy. Maybe this is something that philosophers care about, but it just surprised me. You know, this isn't something that I've really encountered that much. So look, okay, what is meant by like the meaning of life? I assume that this refers to the point or the purpose of life or something like that. Now, I suppose, you know, on the one hand I want to say, well look, meanings, purposes and so on are subjective, right? So I guess I would just lean towards subjective, right? The meaning of life or the purpose of your life is just whatever you want it to be. But I'm inclined to say non-existent because I don't think anybody really does actually assign any coherent meaning or purpose to their life as a whole. I'm just not sure what that could consist in. I mean, particular activities that you do have purposes, right? So you know, I might go downstairs and go to the fridge, right, for the purpose of satisfying my hunger. I might give money to charity for the purpose of improving the conditions of the human race. You know, I might like join some political activist group for the purposes of achieving political goals, and so on, right? So there are specific activities we do that have various purposes. I just don't know. I don't know what it could be for life as a whole to have a purpose. I mean, maybe if you think that like there is a God, and God made us for some reason, right? Like there was a plan that God had when he created us. Well, but then in that case, I still find it difficult to conceive of how you would think of your own life as having a purpose. So God has a purpose in making you, right? but you wouldn't have to share the same purposes as God. So like you can still have. I mean, you certainly do have purposes that are different from whatever God's purposes are. So I really, I just can't really conceive of what the purpose of your life as a whole could be. And so that's why I lean towards non-existent. Like as I say, I want to say subjective, but my inclination is to say that if there are people who think of their lives as a whole as having a purpose, my inclination is to think if we actually analyse that, if we get them to think critically about that, it's going to turn out that it's not actually, they're not really thinking of something that has any coherent content. And so that's why I lean toward non-existent. Epistemic justification, internalism, political philosophy, libertarianism, moral motivation, internalism, politics, capitalism or socialism, lean towards socialism if we're interpreting the term broadly, which I assume we are because it just says capitalism or socialism. And I don't really identify as a capitalist anymore. So, I'm not. I don't buy into capitalist property rights. I think I'm just going to have to lean towards socialism there. But, it depends on how you're using the term, right? But assuming that we can count people like the individualist anarchists as types of socialists, like the free market anti-capitalists, as long as they count as types of socialists, then I think I will as well. A priori knowledge, no. Teletransporter, death. External world, I think that's too unclear to answer. Law, I have no idea. Legal positivism or non-positivism, I have no idea what that is. I have never encountered this debate before in my life, so I am insufficiently familiar. Trolley problem, the classic trolley problem. Yeah, I lean towards don't switch, but like the previous one, the footbridge one, this again is what ought you do. So I think I'm going to reject both of them. There is no moral obligation either way. No moral obligation either way. I would lean towards not switching, but there is no moral obligation either way. Abstract objects, nominalism, zombies, inconceivable, normative ethics. I think I lean towards some type of contractarianism. I believe when I answered this question before on the previous PhilPapers survey, I just went with the options that it gave, so deontology, consequentialism, or virtue ethics. But no, I think I lean towards some type of contractarianism. So the thing is that look, I don't buy into all of the initial position and state of nature stuff that you get in the standard contractarian literature, but the basic idea that moral rules, moral theories, moral arguments are something that we kind of construct on the basis of cooperation out of mutual self-interest. I find that quite appealing. Because I think, okay, what else could what could the basis for our moral theories be? And so one option, obviously, is this cooperation out of self-interest, right? Like self-interested cooperation, reciprocal altruism. That's one kind of basis that they can have. The other is just brute emotions. You just you feel certain things, right, towards certain actions. So you see somebody stealing money from a homeless person or kicking a dog, and you just feel anger at that. Or maybe you see two gay men kissing and you feel disgust, and like that just forms the basis of a moral judgment. Or you see somebody giving money to charity and you feel good about that. Like, okay, you can totally, yeah, you can make moral judgments on the basis of emotions as well. It's just I feel like if we're constructing a moral theory, if we're trying to give compelling arguments, I just don't know how to do that on the basis of brute emotional reactions. I guess actually, I suppose you can't you? Because, well, a lot of arguments that people actually give are not attempting to be like rationally compelling. They're just attempting to emotionally manipulate the audience. I think that's probably the case for many people, but I'm not really very good at that. Like, I'm a philosopher. I'm not, a politician, so I don't generally just go like appeal to people's emotions. So that's why I say lean toward some sort of contractarianism. Vagueness, semantic, epistemic, or metaphysical. I think I have to say lean towards semantic here. I mean, I should say, look, this is not a debate that I am particularly familiar with, but I mean, vagueness seems to me to be a product of our representations of the world. In fact, I really struggle to... I don't really understand what it would even mean for vagueness to be in the world itself, right? Like, that seems really strange to me. It seems almost like a kind of category error to think of like the world itself as being vague. It's surely, obviously, a product of the way in which we classify it. We develop certain classification schemes. I mean, the world is very, very complex, right? But we have these classification schemes, and that, because of the complexity of the world, and because we have to simplify, in order for us to talk about the world and understand the world, we have to simplify. That then generates vagueness as a result, because you've got this extremely complex system, and then you've got this simplified image of it, a simplified representation of it, and that's where the vagueness arises. So I don't think I can accept metaphysical vagueness. Now, as for the epistemic view of vagueness, I believe this is Williamson's view. I believe this is the idea that actually vague predicates aren't really vague. Like, there is... So when you ask, okay, how many hairs on a head do you need to distinguish somebody who's bald from somebody who's not bald, the epistemic account will say there is really a fact of the matter. And it might be like, 1,117 hairs. Exactly 1,117 hairs distinguishes... That's the difference. Like, if you've got 1,116 hairs, you're bald. But if you've got 1,117 hairs, you're not bald. That's so bizarre to me that I don't know. I haven't really engaged with the arguments, but that just seems completely nuts. So yeah, I'm going to lean towards semantic. Maybe I should say I'm insufficiently familiar with it, really. But look, I want to give answers where I can, and I do have inclinations on this one. Gender, unreal, social, biological, psychological. I think I accept a social account of this. So I'm quite happy with the sex gender distinction. I mean, there are vague cases, like all distinctions. There are problems, but it makes a lot of sense to me that yes, we can talk about, say, biological sex, and maybe we're defining that in terms of the gametes that an organism produces, organisms that produce sperm are male, organisms that produce eggs are female, and that's very, very strongly correlated to certain gender expressions. But the gender in itself is social, and it's possible for people to move from one social category to another. I mean, I do sort of think, so should I give the same answer on gender as I give to race? Because, in case of both gender and race, you're talking about these social categories that are connected to biological features, right? Race is, something that is based on, say, skin color or ancestry or something like that. And in the case of gender, again, there are obvious biological features that it's like, you have the biological distinction between male and female, between the organisms that produce sperm and organisms that produce eggs, right? And then gender kind of arises out of that. I guess that it just feels, so the case of gender feels a little bit different, just because with race, it looks like people are focusing on what are basically just completely irrelevant characteristics, like so skin color doesn't like actually matter. It doesn't make a difference to anything. Gender, on the other hand, is not determined by biology, but the biological characteristics that it's kind of correlated to are more significant. So just consider that, like, females give birth, males don't. There are physical differences which make females and males females in general have like less muscle mass or whatever, and those kinds of differences are of great social significance. So yeah, for those reasons, I lean towards a social account rather than saying that it's unreal. But I don't know. I mean, maybe there's not really much of a distinction between the social and unreal position. Okay, analysis of knowledge. Yeah, I accept justified true belief, certainly for the purposes of philosophy. What about Gettier cases? Well, I think that the importance of Gettier cases is massively overstated. Massively overstated. Look, any analysis of knowledge on which justification does not entail truth is going to be subject to Gettier problems. You're going to be able to generate Gettier cases. And so the only way to avoid Gettier cases is just to say, no, in order to have a justified belief, that belief has to be true, right? Like, you cannot have justification, you cannot have a justified false belief. Right? As long as you allow that there can be justified false beliefs, I think you're going to be able to generate Gettier cases. But accepting some Gettier cases as cases of near misses, let's say, as cases of knowledge that were nearly not knowledge, right? Accepting some Gettier cases just strikes me as much more plausible than rejecting that there can be justified false beliefs. Like, of course there can be justified false beliefs, and I think any useful analysis of knowledge, any analysis of the concept of knowledge that is actually going to be useful for philosophical purposes, I think has to account for justified false beliefs. You don't want to make justification entail truth. I just accept that one, and I would simply embrace the Gettier cases as cases of knowledge. Units of selection, organisms or genes. I don't think there's a fact to the matter here. Or maybe I should just say that there are no units of selection, actually. It's not so much that there is no fact to the matter, but that should I just reject all of them? We'll stick with that one. It's the unit of selection is a feature of biological models, not a feature of the world. In different contexts, different ways of carving up the biological population will be appropriate. I'm going to do a video on this topic actually shortly. I have more to say about this, but I don't want to talk off the top of my head about it because I'm in the middle actually of writing something about this, and I haven't quite got exactly down what I want to say, but hopefully a video on this will be coming soon. But yeah, certainly an anti-realist about this kind of thing. So, philosophical methods. Now, okay, there are a whole bunch of different methods that we can apply in philosophy. Which of these are the most useful or important? Now, first of all, here, empirical philosophy, I've put neutral because I don't really know what that is. Conceptual engineering, yep, completely accept that. I think that's basically the right way to go. Taking the confused concepts of ordinary language and engineering them into something better, something more useful. Linguistic philosophy, again, a little bit vague. Not entirely sure what that involves. Yeah, I mean, so I assume that this just is attention to our language. I don't know. So I'm assuming this is going to cover things like ideal language philosophy and ordinary language philosophy and all of that stuff. And there can be useful applications for that. I mean, so if you want to do conceptual engineering, then you're going to have to pay some attention to how the concepts are actually used and the sort of functional roles that they're playing and so on. So I think that's going to come under linguistic philosophy. Experimental philosophy, I'm neutral on this one. So I think experimental philosophy is... It has produced some very interesting results, and which are useful for challenging some of the traditional ways that philosophers have gone about answering their questions. So in particular, experimental philosophy has produced some important challenges to the appeal to philosophical intuitions. But I'm neutral on it because I'm just not sure that it has much to contribute in terms of positive answers to philosophical questions. Although maybe, I don't know, maybe I lean toward it. I don't know. It depends on how people use these methods, doesn't it? This is kind of a silly question, really. Conceptual analysis, I mean, I suppose I have to say I lean against it, because so the basic idea of conceptual analysis is breaking the concepts down, finding necessary and sufficient conditions for their application, but I don't think there are necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of any concept. I mean, the thing is, conceptual analysis can have... Again, if the general goal is conceptual engineering, then there may be an important use for conceptual analysis. Like, once you have constructed a more precise concept, maybe subjecting that to conceptual analysis is okay. But the way that conceptual analysis has been used by philosophers is misguided. Intuition-based philosophy, well, intuitions certainly do not tell us anything about the world, but so that's why I've put lean against. There are all kinds of ways in which philosophers have appealed to intuitions which I think are misguided. You find people appealing to intuitions in philosophy of mind, in metaphysics and so on, and I don't think intuitions are truth tracking, but what are sometimes called application intuitions, so intuitions about the applications of our concepts, that's fine. So that's okay in that sort of context. So when people say, well, a Gettier case intuitively is not knowledge, yeah, fair enough. I'm kind of happy to accept that. But I also think that in that kind of case, it's fairly easy to just dismiss intuitions. So intuitions about the application of concepts to cases, and especially when we're talking about cases which are relatively unusual, the thought experiments with which have these bizarre scenarios that we wouldn't usually encounter. I don't know how much weight to really put on intuitions in that kind of context. The one case where I would say that intuitions are perfectly acceptable is if you are developing
a moral theory, you can, if you want, base it on your moral intuitions. But bear in mind what I just said earlier about my reasons for, being inclined towards a more contractarian sort of view. Moral intuitions, I think, are going to just arise from emotional dispositions, and I don't know. I don't know really how to construct a compelling argument on that basis. So yeah, even there, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing that, right? Like, there's nothing incorrect about constructing moral theory on the basis of intuitions, and maybe at some level intuitions are going to be unavoidable, but I still would say that I lean against them there. Formal philosophy, so I think this is just stuff like the development of probability theory and Bayesianism and applying that to things like epistemology. Yep, that's all cool. So that's what I've said, but to be honest, I think this is a bit of a stupid question. Newcomb's problem, obviously I am a one boxer. Causation, obviously I think it's non-existent. So those are the 50 main questions in the new philpapers survey, and there's a whole bunch of additional questions as well, an additional 50. So there's a question here about semantic content, minimalism, moderate contextualism, or radical contextualism. I have no idea, I've never heard of that before in my life. So Hume, what is his view, naturalist or skeptic? There are lots of different ways of interpreting Hume, and I suppose the thing is I'm a little bit unclear about this, because surely it depends on what specific part of Hume's philosophy you're talking about, right? Like, you might say that Hume adopts a skeptical account of causation, but actually he doesn't adopt a skeptical account of the self, right? Although a lot of people have interpreted him as a skeptic about the self, maybe he actually isn't. So yeah, I mean, surely it depends on which topic you're talking about. But I've said lean towards skeptic because my inclination is to interpret Hume as advancing generally skeptical theses about a wide range of things. So I do interpret him as a skeptic about causality, as a skeptic about the self, about induction, all of this stuff. I that's how I interpret him. I don't interpret him as a naturalist. Well, I mean, I guess. Look, here's the thing. I don't really know, right? There are these debates about how should we interpret Hume, and my honest answer is if the question is what did he actually mean, well, I'm not sure. I think there are plausible arguments both ways, but it is more interesting. He is more interesting if you take him to be advancing these skeptical theses, and I will always prefer the more interesting interpretation over the correct one. So that's why I say that. Foundations in mathematics, I do not know. Aesthetic experience, again, I don't know, not familiar enough with this. Rational disagreement, can two people with the same evidence rationally disagree? So yeah, I'm very strongly permissive on this one. Permissivism being the view that, yes, indeed, two people with the same evidence can rationally disagree. Yeah, look, part of this is, I think, fairly straightforward. If you have different values, that can quite reasonably lead you to make different judgments. So if I am somebody who cares a lot about maximizing true beliefs and I'm not really worried about having false beliefs, then, I'm going to be a lot more promiscuous in what I believe than somebody who is more risk averse, than somebody who wants to avoid having false beliefs. Obviously, we want the true beliefs, we want to gain true beliefs, and we want to avoid false beliefs, but those two different goals pull us in different directions, because whatever methods we use to form true beliefs, or whatever basis we use to form true beliefs, that's also likely to let in some false beliefs. But look, I think the more important point here is, I'm a Firebendian. I don't think there are any rules for belief formation or belief revision.
And I don't think there needs to be rules for that in order for us to be able to make judgments about, you know, whether or not somebody's belief is well supported, or whether or not somebody's methods for forming beliefs are sensible, or whatever. You know, all of us in forming any belief at all, you know, we are to some degree sticking our necks out. And there are various different methods that we might apply to arrive at beliefs about the world. But it's always, in principle, okay to kind of sort of, you know, look at the methods you're currently applying and say, okay, this isn't working. I'm just going to do something completely different. I'm going to throw them out. I'm going to have a, you know, conceptual revolution, whatever. Like, this is acceptable rationally. I think that, you know, yeah. So I'm extremely permissive. I think I'm basically a kind of epistemological voluntarist. You know, I do not think that there are really... I certainly don't think there are rules, let's say, for belief formation on the basis of any given evidence. And, like, yes, the question is, does this person have good reasons for their beliefs? There are ways of evaluating that. I don't think then there need to be rules of belief formation for that to be possible. But certainly, you know, yeah, I think there can be very wide scope for rational disagreement. Right, abortion. I think it's permissible. I think it's permissible not just in the first trimester, but at any stage in pregnancy for any reason whatsoever. Yeah, and for me, it's just a matter of, like, containment. If you are contained in the body of somebody else, it's okay for that person to kill you, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I suppose I see it as basically a matter of self-defense, really. If there is somebody occupying your body without your consent, then it's okay to use lethal force in response. And that if you're pregnant, then, and you decide you don't want to be pregnant anymore, then the fetus is occupying your body without your consent, so you can use lethal force to get rid of it. The fact that, you know, you chose to have sex, and you knew that having a fetus there was a risk, I don't give a shit about that. That's just completely irrelevant to me. I don't think that consenting to sex entails consenting to pregnancy, and even if it did, you can revoke consent for any reason at any time. So, you know, even if you have consented to the pregnancy, you can just change your mind and then get rid of it. Perfectly fine, as far as I'm concerned. Propositions. Well, structured entities, access, simple entities, non-existent. Well, you know, I don't really know this debate all that well, but I have said alternative view, mental entities. So if we are defining proposition broadly to just mean the meaning of a sentence. So the broad definition of a proposition is that a proposition is the meaning of a sentence. And this is the sense in which we would say that, you know, snow is white, and that German sentence that looks like it's pronounced Schnee ist weiss, although maybe it's not pronounced like that because I don't know how to pronounce German. But you know what I'm talking about. You know the standard example in philosophy. You got snow is white and you got Schnee ist weiss, or whatever the fuck it is. So those two things, two different sentences, we say, okay, they express the same proposition because they mean the same thing. You know, you translate Schnee ist weiss as snow is white, right? So they mean the same thing. Now, if proposition is just the meaning of a sentence, then I'm going to say it's a mental entity. Propositions are thought tokens. Meanings are things that we construct. They're things in our heads. They're thoughts. So, in that sense, propositions are mental entities. Now, you might be defining proposition more narrowly, though. Some philosophers use proposition to refer to kind of abstract mind-independent objects that can be the shared objects of beliefs and other propositional attitudes, I guess. So when I believe that snow is white, and you believe that snow is white, the thought is there is something that is shared between us. There is a shared proposition, because we believe the same proposition, is the idea. We're believing the same thing, and since we believe the same thing, there is something that's shared between us, and so that must be something abstract and mind independent. Well, in that sense, obviously propositions are non-existent, but I'm just going with the mental entities view here. Concepts, nativism or empiricism. So are concepts, are there innate concepts? I mean, I don't know how to even begin answering this, because I don't know how to define innateness. I have a video series on innateness, actually, nature versus nurture, I think it's called, and I talk about the distinction between innate and acquired characteristics, and it turns out that in modern biology and modern psychology, that is a very, very difficult distinction to draw. I'm actually inclined to be skeptical that this is a distinction that is meaningful, or at least that can be made meaningful. I'm not sure that it really has a useful theoretical role. And of course, until we've got a clear sense of the distinction between innate and acquired characteristics, this debate about concepts just doesn't get off the ground. So I don't know. I find it too unclear to answer. Response to external world skepticism, which is the strongest? Right, I definitely don't accept semantic externalism, contextualism, epistemic externalism, the abductive response, or dogmatism. Dogmatism, I assume, is G.E. Moore, right? That's the kind of Morean response that, we can be more confident about the claims of common sense than we can be for any philosophical proposition that is appealed to in a skeptical argument. I just don't agree with that. I don't place that kind of weight on common sense. I'm not even sure what counts as part of common sense. And in any case, it seems to me that actually the skeptical argument is itself kind of part of common sense, right? Like, I remember being a kid and thinking, okay, how do I know that the external world exists? So it seems to me that actually, like, you can't. So common sense doesn't discriminate, right? Like, even if you are a Morean, I don't think you can rule out skepticism, because it seems to me that external world skepticism is just part of common sense. But okay, the abductive position, inference to the best explanation. The best explanation for the coherence and stability and so on of our perceptions is that there is an external world. That just seems. So first of all, look, I have all sorts of dreams that exhibit stability and coherence and so on. But more importantly, I don't know how you can really evaluate whether your perceptions actually exhibit these features unless you're assuming the reliability of memory. But I think pretty much look, the skeptical argument against the external world works just as well against memory, right? So, I mean, I guess if there was somebody who was just an external world skeptic, but who thought that memory is reliable, then maybe you would be able to forward an abductive argument. But I just don't see for somebody who's kind of consistently skeptical, let's say, who therefore is skeptical of our memory capacities just as much as our perceptual capacities, for somebody of that position, I don't know how you can possibly get an abductive argument off the ground, because you're not going to be able to say, like, there's just no reason to think that our perceptions actually exhibit coherence and stability, and that therefore this is something that needs to be explained. Okay, look, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I don't think there are really, I don't know, I'm not sure there are any compelling responses to external world skepticism, just beyond the point that I'm kind of inclined to think that, like, they're just, what I kind of want to say is that, well, there just isn't really a problem here, right? Like, there's not really a question that there's an external world, because, like,
as I mentioned in response to the experience machine question, right? My reaction to that is, well, the world of the experience machine just is a world, right? Like, it's not a fake world, it's not, you know, an artificial world, it just is a world, but with an unusual metaphysics. And I think I kind of want to say, you know, the same about like external world skepticism. The idea that, you know, there is, you know, that this world might be fake, in some sense, or whatever. I want to resist that. But the problem is, well, I do draw a distinction between the real world and my dreams. And I think that distinction is going to be enough to get the skeptical argument off the ground. So, yeah, I think that I probably lean towards a kind of pragmatic response, or maybe just a sort of Humean response. Certainly, look, I certainly don't think that there is anything irrational about believing in an external world, regardless of whether or not it is, you know, justified. Rationality, as I mentioned, I don't think there are, you know, rules of belief formation or belief revision. Insofar as, like, what are the constraints of rationality? Well, I think that we want our general view of the world to be coherent, broadly speaking. So we want, you know, logical consistency in some sense. We want our beliefs and our, you know, inclinations to issue in successful action in the world. So we want to be able to, you know, bring our experiences in line with what we expect and what we desire. You know, we want to be able to make predictions and so on. As long as you can do all of that successfully, I'm going to count you as rational. And I mean, there's like it doesn't. There's nothing irrational then about supposing that there's an external world. So. Yeah, I don't know what to do with this particular one, but I think I'm going to end up leaning towards a kind of pragmatic view. Right. Human genetic engineering, I just don't have a problem with this. I don't have anything in particular to say about it. It just seems, yep, that seems good. I would like to get rid of diseases and stuff, and I would like to make people happier and healthier, and genetic engineering is a tool. Obviously, there are ways in which this can be applied badly, no doubt about that at all. But like, so can lots of other tools, right? Like, it's a tool. It has bad applications and good applications. I think it's very strange for some that people hold like just a general impermissible position on this. So, yeah, permissible. Space-time, I don't know. I'm an anti-realist. Continuum hypothesis, I'm not familiar enough with this to say. Other minds, totally agnostic on this one. So, I think, look, we just don't know how far consciousness spreads and extends. As I have written down here, look, for all I know, panpsychism might be true, right? Maybe even rocks are conscious. Maybe they have some phenomenal states. I don't know. I mean, look, there are. I think the arguments for like panpsychism are just as convincing as the arguments for standard physicalism or identity theory or functionalism or whatever. So. Maybe panpsychism is true. It seems like a perfectly sensible position to me. It seems just as sensible as basically every other position on consciousness. So maybe that's true. And you know, even if it didn't strike me as sensible, I don't think our intuitions about this are remotely reliable. Like, this is just not something where, you know, we can rely on intuitions to give us access to the facts. So, you know, the fact that panpsychism strikes a lot of people as absurd is totally irrelevant. So yeah, maybe panpsychism is true, or maybe consciousness is really restricted. Maybe it's restricted just to those entities that are capable of
engaging in self-reflection, engaging in like higher order thoughts, using language, that sort of thing. Maybe not even babies are conscious. I have no idea. I don't think anyone else really knows either. So I am agnostic about this. Justification. Well, I guess I would lean towards some sort of coherentism. I lean towards a kind of web of belief type view. Coherentism has always struck me as probably the most plausible, but I'm not. I don't follow this debate all that closely, really. So I don't know, but I think I lean towards coherentism. Values in science. Well, there's a lot to say about this. Okay, so the question is, values in science. Is ideal scientific reasoning necessarily sensitive or insensitive to non-epistemic values? Now, first point, I don't really buy the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. It's quite clear that different philosophical assumptions will lead to different views of what counts as an epistemic value. So is simplicity an epistemic value, or is it merely a pragmatic value? Now, if you adopt a particular philosophical position, if you fix your philosophical position, then yeah, you can say from that perspective what counts as an epistemic value. So as a fairly extreme empiricist, I might say, well, look, the only epistemic value is accommodation of observable phenomena, or something like that, right? Like the epistemic value is, right, the theory needs to issue in correct predictions. You need to be able to use the theory to make lots of reliable predictions. The theory needs to be able to accommodate, to systematize observable phenomena. That's basically it, right? And simplicity, explanatory scope, beauty, all of this, those are just gonna count as pragmatic values, rather than epistemic values. If you fix that general philosophical position, then you can get an answer about what the epistemic values are. But as I have suggested in my point about the rational disagreement question, I think disagreement on this is perfectly reasonable. I cannot see how science, we're talking about values in science here, I can't see how science would be served by all scientists adopting a particular philosophical position. In fact, in general, I don't think it really matters what philosophical position scientists adopt. It doesn't matter whether a scientist is an empiricist or something else. Like if a scientist wants to engage in speculative metaphysics, then they can go right ahead. That's not necessarily going to make them a bad scientist. It might even help them come up with good scientific hypotheses. Who knows? Scientific hypotheses can be generated from all kinds of. Some people have had dreams. The benzene molecule, the structure of that was originally thought of in a dream, right? So you can generate hypotheses however you want. I don't see how science would be served by fixing a philosophical position for all scientists. But look, okay, suppose that there were a sensible distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. Well, now the issue is, if we're talking about theory acceptance, we have to fix the standards for acceptance. Like, what's the confidence interval, 5% or 1% or something else? That's going to depend on what we're testing and on what kinds of risks we're willing to take. It just seems obvious, right, that in the case of it, so it's going to be dependent on the type of evidence that we have available, the power of our statistical tools, the risks we want to take. If we're doing medicine, then we're not going to be willing to take many risks with respect to the side effects of medications or something like that. Like, we want to be really, really sure that these medications are not going to cause heart attacks or something. On the other hand, if you're just constructing a sociological theory, well, the kind of evidence that may be available in sociology is just not as precise and secure as the kind of evidence that you can get in medical studies.
Like especially if you're imagining a very broad, very general sociological theory, of like, I don't know how the nature of how people act in corporations or something. I mean, this it's just a very general sociological theory. You're not going to have such precise evidence for that, and also it's just you're not taking that much of a risk really. So the standards for acceptance will be lower. And so in that respect, it seems like there's going to have to be non-epistemic values involved, because we have to fix standards for acceptance, and that's not an epistemic value, surely. Okay. Third point. I don't think there's really such a thing as ideal scientific reasoning. What the hell is that? Ideal scientific reasoning? First of all, there is no scientific method. Science is disunified, and there are just a whole host of different methods that scientists may apply. Secondly, science often operates better with a diversity of biases, a diversity of views, a diversity of approaches. I don't really buy that. I think I'm going to have to say, the question is too unclear to answer, because I don't buy into ideal scientific reasoning in the first place. Even if I did, I don't really buy the distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values, it's just too unclear to answer. Mind uploading, brain replaced by digital emulation. Well, look, I have to lean towards death on this one. It's just like the case of the transporter, right? If I get into a transporter machine, teletransport, if I get into a teleporter machine, it vaporizes my body, and then a copy of the body is produced elsewhere. Well, I'm not willing to use any form of transport that involves the total vaporization of my brain and body. In the same way, brain replaced by digital emulation, I'm not prepared to engage in any kind of activity that involves my brain being replaced. So, maybe if I'm on death's door and this is the only chance I've got, then I'll give it a shot. But I'm sorry, I'm not doing it in any other circumstance. Method in history of philosophy, I don't know the issue. Philosophical knowledge, a little, a lot, or none. Well, I would say a little, and basically just see my answer to the philosophical progress question. Obviously, it's the same answer here. Theory of reference. I think it's just indeterminate. Sometimes, so reference is fixed by descriptions, or it may be fixed in a causal way, or it may be fixed in some other way, and I don't think there's really any fact to the matter. It just depends on, what it just depends on what the most useful way is of thinking about the language that a particular person is using. If you're doing a study of the history of science or something, then there are going to be lots of terms where some of those terms you will say just don't refer anymore, like phlogiston, and some of those terms like electron, even though the beliefs about electrons have changed, you think, okay, they do refer. Is there really a fact of the matter about reference over time? No, I don't think there is. And in fact, even in a single instance, I don't think that, I don't think words have determinate extensions. I don't think concepts have determinate extensions. So even at a single time, reference is indeterminate in that way. Principle of sufficient reason. Obviously, I reject this. As I've said, I'm an empiricist, so I don't suppose there's really much to say there. Immortality. Would you choose it? I would definitely choose immortality. I really don't want to die. The reason why I have never done any work on philosophy of death is because I am terrified of death. I am just overwhelmingly. It produces a sense of just
absolutely overwhelming, overpowering terror and dread that I will not exist forever. The fact that I am going to stop existing is just unacceptable to me. Well, let me clarify. The fact that I'm going to stop existing permanently. So if I was to stop existing for 13 billion years and then start existing again, I would be totally cool with that. That's fine, right? If I just happen to not be there for a little while, fine, right? But permanent non-existence is unacceptable. And like I say, I can't. I mean, I cannot put into words, right, the utter, overwhelming horror that this produces. Very often, maybe not every day, but quite often, if I'm in bed or something and I'm not doing anything, I'll think of death. And there's a sort of intellectual understanding that I'm not going to exist forever. Like, I've got that all the time. But sometimes I really get what that means. I get it. I get the permanent non-existence. I mean, like right now, I would say I'm talking about it intellectually, but I don't get it. I don't get what it means. But sometimes it's like something clicks in my head, and I suddenly sort of see it. I comprehend permanent non-existence, and it is the most horrifying thing. I would 100% choose immortality. I'm perfectly happy just, like if the universe ends and I'm just floating around on my own in space, I'm perfectly happy with that. That is infinitely better than non-existence. What people always say to this, like some people get this, some people don't. The usual answer is, well, you weren't around before you were born, and that was okay, so why are you worried about death? But first of all, like, okay, I wasn't around before I was born, but then I was born and I started existing. So, like I said, if I was to stop existing and then start existing again, I'm totally cool with that, right? It's the permanent non-existence. Permanent non-existence hasn't happened to me before because I'm here now. But also, like, that was in the past, right? So why would I worry about something that happened in the past? I'm not concerned about the past. It doesn't, like I wasn't around in the past. Whatever, that's the past. That's gone. I don't give a shit about that. I get it, right? Once I'm dead, I won't know, and so I won't care, so there won't be any pain, there won't be any suffering. But that's precisely the problem. I won't know. I won't be there. That is exactly the problem. 100%. I want to be immortal. So we need to get on that and sort this out. And figure out how to achieve immortality, please. Possible worlds: abstract, concrete, non-existent. Obviously non-existent. They are useful fictions. There's no reason whatsoever to believe that they actually exist, either as abstract or concrete, or any other kind of entity. Method in political philosophy. So I don't really know this debate all that well, but I think I lean toward ideal theory. I think ideal theory is like, it's the kind of thing that people like Rawls and Nozick were doing, right? Whereas non-ideal theory is a lot more practical. It's kind of applying political philosophy to practical issues that affect us today. Ideal theory tends to be more sort of utopian. You tend to think, okay, what would be the ideal structure of society? At least that's as far as I understand this debate, but I really don't know. So maybe I've completely misinterpreted what this is all about. But yeah, if I've got it right there, then I lean toward ideal theory. That's the kind of political philosophy that I'm interested in. Properties, classes, universals, non-existent tropes or immanent universals. So I think I accept classes. I'm definitely a nominalist about properties, and a property. So when I say that I accept classes, I think that we construct the classes. So I'd be happy to say that, like, properties are sets of instances, or they're classes of instances.
or maybe even properties are like concepts or something. But yeah, I mean, we construct the classes of the instances that count as properties. So the property of redness is there are red things in the world, right? But the property of redness is just the class of those red things, and that class is something that we have constructed. Normative concepts, which is most fundamental? I have no idea what this debate is, or really even what that question means. Belief or credence? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that either of these is more fundamental. Sometimes it's useful to frame things in terms of belief, sometimes more so in terms of credence. I mean, I don't know. I haven't paid much attention to this debate, but maybe I should say I'm not really sufficiently familiar with it. But it's just a matter of like how we want to model what's going on in people's minds, and that depends on what it is we're studying, what question we're asking. So I don't see why we would think of either of these as being more fundamental than another. So Chinese room doesn't understand or understands. Well, if the Chinese room is operating as it is stipulated in the thought experiment, which, yeah, I mean, I say lean towards understands, but it's kind of hard to imagine if we're supposed to imagine something that can communicate just in the same way that a person does. Then I'm just happy to attribute understanding to it, whatever's going on inside, right? But that's the key point, right? Like, because of the way the thought experiment is set up, it's sort of hard to imagine that the Chinese room could communicate in the way that a person does. Because Searle says, oh well, imagine that I'm sitting in a room and I get something, slip of paper sent in with some Chinese symbols, and then I have to look up a book and I have to look through the book. I mean, obviously, as something that is structured like that is not going to be communicating in anything like the way a person does. It's not going to be interacting in anything like the way a person does. But if we just stipulate that the Chinese room somehow does do that, then I would be happy to say it understands. Kant, I don't know. Statue and lump, basically no facts of matter for the same reason as for the material composition question. It's just context dependent. Okay, capital punishment, permissible or impermissible? So I think it's impermissible. Okay, 2 points here, right? First point is, look, any punishment that is, exacted by the state, any state-sanctioned punishment, I'm going to have to say is impermissible because I don't think the state should exist anyway, right? So it shouldn't be punishing people at all, just because it shouldn't exist. But putting that point aside, right, let's just ignore that. Maybe things like imprisonment are fine, right? Like there are cases where we have to imprison people. So why not capital punishment? What's the problem with that? It just seems to me like if we're going to be killing people, there has to be there has to be a good justification for it. Like there has to be a good reason. You can't just go around killing people, right? You got to give a good reason. I mean, self-defense is a perfectly good reason. If somebody's attacking you and you kill them in self-defense, fair enough. But capital punishment. What's the reason for this? What's the justification for it? Well, so one possibility is deterrence, but it doesn't seem to me like there's much evidence that capital punishment is a particularly effective deterrent. In fact, if anything, I mean, there seems to be evidence that capital punishment has the opposite effect, that capital punishment actually encourages violent crime. Like I'm not sure about what the general consensus is among sociologists on this, but I have definitely seen studies which have suggested that capital punishment tends to increase violent crime, and I mean, there's different hypotheses for why that might be. I like maybe just the fact that the state is engaging in violence kind of legitimizes violence in the minds of the population, or something like that. But I mean, certainly there is, I think, a correlation, right? Like generally speaking, it seems that the places which have capital punishment also have higher homicide rates. Again, I'm not really that familiar with the literature here, so maybe somebody can correct me on this one. I'm sure I remember reading a study that it actually looked at like different states in America, because obviously, America, some states have capital punishment, some don't. The states with capital punishment had higher homicide rates, but I'm also sure there was a study which found that if you look at states which had high-profile capital punishment cases, high-profile executions, after that, the homicide rate spiked. I might be wrong. I'm sure I remember reading that study somewhere. If anybody knows about that, maybe you could let me know. But look, I am very confident that there's no consensus that capital punishment is an effective deterrent. So if it does work as a deterrent, the effect is very minimal. And I mean, just look, there's no question, is there, that like societies over time, right, the state has, there have been increasing constraints on what the state can do to its citizens, right, in terms of like the infliction of bodily harm. And you also find over time lower homicide rates. It just seems like we have become more peaceful in that respect, and that seems like a good thing to me. So yeah, I don't think that deterrence justifies capital punishment. What about retribution? Well, I don't think the state should be engaging in retribution at all. So I don't think punishment is ever justified by retribution. Incapacitation is sometimes, that's a important justification for punishment. Is there are certain people that we just need to kind of remove from society because they're dangerous, and obviously capital punishment is a very effective means of incapacitating somebody, but there are other ways to incapacitate people. So basically, I think what are the justifications for punishment? It just seems to me like none of them really provide a good reason for capital punishment. So like I say, my general assumption is if you're going to kill somebody, if you're going to kill a person, a person who is like, and a person who is not posing a direct and immediate threat to anybody else, right? There had better be a very good reason for it, and I don't see that reason in the case of capital punishment. Environmental ethics, well, obviously anthropocentric. Ethics is thoroughly anthropocentric, as should be obvious from things I've said in response to other ethics questions here. Temporal ontology, I have no idea. I am just not. I'm agnostic. Like I've said, I'm a scientific anti-realist. I don't really buy into metaphysical theorizing, etc. So I'm agnostic about this. Gender categories: preserve, eliminate, or revise. In the long run, right? I mean, like, yeah, I'm cool with elimination. Eliminating the gender categories. I'm cool with gender abolitionism. It seems like that would be better in the long run if we just if we just didn't have these gender norms, if we judged people as individuals. It seems like that's a useful ideal, right? Like maybe it will never happen, but certainly gender norms are just complete bullshit. So I like gender categories. I think ultimately I lean towards abolitionism. Now, problem with this in the shorter term is
I'm very worried about how the gender abolitionist view has actually manifested itself in current political discourse, and I'm talking here about the TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists, because they're gender abolitionists, but on the basis of their gender abolitionism, they have these objections to trans people. I mean, and the assumption seems to be, well, look, trans people are, like, if you are a trans woman, then the idea that a man can become a woman, right, that requires a distinction between sex and gender. And so, and in changing from a man to a woman, you are assuming that gender is defined in terms of, say, physical appearance or behavioral roles or something like that. So you're actually supporting traditional gender categories. Does that make sense? I think that's the kind of argument that they use. My own suspicion actually is that this kind of argument is just self-undermining. In practice, if you want to, in the long run, eliminate gender norms, if you want to eliminate gender categories, I think the way to do it is to encourage all kinds of deviance. It's to encourage men to become women and women to become men. It's to encourage people to just not care about gender. It's to encourage people to be gender non-binary and to just adopt ways of existence outside the gender, the traditional gender categories, and so on. Encourage as much deviance as you want, right? Just encourage people to be themselves, or not to be themselves, to construct themselves in new ways. It's like, surely, if you want to kind of lay the groundwork for the elimination of gender, or if you want to reduce the importance of traditional gender roles, you should be encouraging people who violate those traditional gender roles. And transgender people, unquestionably, their very existence is kind of standing against, they are violating traditional views of gender and traditional gender norms. The idea that you can just change your gender, that a man can just become a woman or a woman can become a man, that's not in line with the traditional view. Traditional view would have it that gender is fixed. So yeah, I'm inclined towards abolitionism. Unfortunately, it seems like the abolitionist position has become associated with the trans exclusionary radical feminists. I think it's weird that there's this minority of feminists who are so mad about trans people, but ultimately I think it's the right position, and just because there's some jerks who hold the right position, I'm not going to change my mind about that just because of that. Okay, ought implies can. I am simply not familiar enough with this particular issue to say anything. Wittgenstein, which do you prefer, early or late? Well, I lean toward late Wittgenstein. I'm not really keen on Wittgenstein in general. He's not really one of my favourite philosophers, but the Tractatus is genuinely awful, so I have to lean toward late on that one. Meta-ontology, deflationary realism, heavyweight realism, or anti-realism. Okay, my understanding of this, and this is not, I'm not all that familiar with this particular literature, but this is a question about whether or not particular ontological questions, whether or not there's a fact of the matter about particular ontological questions. So, I can ask, do numbers exist, for instance, and a Platonist will say, yes, there really are numbers, they are abstract objects that really exist in some platonic realm or whatever, whereas a nominalist or a fictionalist or whatever will say no, right? They're not, there are no abstract objects that really exist. So I can say, so that's a debate about the existence of numbers. Now then you can kind of move up a level and you can ask, well, is there an objective fact of the matter about whether or not numbers exist? And in that case, the realist will say, yes, there is a fact of the matter, and the anti-realist will say no. So a realist would be somebody like Quine in his indispensability argument, right? Quine says that we're ontologically committed to those entities that are indispensable to our best theories. And so, numbers, for instance, are indispensable to our best theories, and so we're ontologically committed to numbers. Numbers really exist. Like, you might resist that by saying, well, actually, no, numbers are not indispensable to our best theories, and so you conclude that numbers don't exist, right? But that Quinean view, that's a realism about this question, because there's a fact of the matter about whether or not numbers exist. An anti-realist approach would be something like Carnap's internal external questions, right? Like, you can assume the kind of framework of mathematics, but like the question is just, is that a useful way of thinking about this particular issue? Is that a useful framework to apply in this particular case? Okay, so the thing is, surely it seems to me the answer to this meta-ontological question is going to depend on the ontological debate in question, right? There's not going to be a general answer to this. So if we're talking about numbers, then I might hold that there is a fact of the matter about whether numbers exist. On the other hand, if we're talking about, say, material constitution or material composition, right? Like, under what conditions do you have a composite object? Maybe I'm going to say there's no facts of the matter about that. I might take an anti-realist line on that. So maybe I'm just not familiar enough with this debate. Maybe I'm confused about what this is, but it seems to me that the answer you take on this, whether you're a heavyweight realist, deflationary realist, or anti-realist, is going to depend on the ontological debate in question. So I don't know. I put question is too unclear to answer, but maybe I should. I mean, I'm not really. Maybe I should be insufficiently familiar. Yeah. Okay, Plato. Yeah, I don't really know Plato. Race categories. Well, I've already talked about race, haven't I? And yeah. Okay. Hard problem of consciousness. So this is the problem of explaining phenomenal experiences. So, I mean, look, I just can't see why there would be any problem in principle explaining consciousness per any of the standard accounts of scientific explanation, right? So, whether it's a deductive nomological account, or a causal account, or a unificationist account, or a pragmatic account, like whatever view you have of scientific explanation, you can totally construct explanations of consciousness. And, okay, look, a scientific model of consciousness is obviously going to be, third person. So there may be properties from the first person point of view that are not embedded in the model, that are not captured by the model or accommodated in the model. But that's just to say that the scientific model doesn't explain everything about consciousness, and that's always the case, right? Like a scientific model of a particular system is never going to explain everything about that system, and not even even if you get a whole set of scientific models of a particular system, it's not going to explain everything about that system. Obviously, scientific models are always going to be third person, as it were. We're never going to get the first person perspective from any system, whether it be a human brain or a rock or whatever. So I say no, right, just because I think, all right, what is it we're actually doing when we give explanations, right? The hard problem of consciousness is a problem about explaining consciousness. And so the question here, what all of this revolves around is what counts as an explanation. And it seems to me that on all of the views of scientific explanation that have actually appeared in the literature, there isn't going to be a problem explaining consciousness. Now, that may not, as it were, tell you everything you want to know about consciousness, or there may still be certain aspects of consciousness that are confusing or are unclear or are not captured in the scientific models we construct. But well, that's just that's just the nature of explanation. It is always going to be limited. So I have to say no on that one. Sleeping Beauty. This is a really interesting little problem, and I just, I'm not unfamiliar with it. I'm just undecided, actually. So I'll change my answer to that one. No, this is a really cool little problem about probability. I
I keep coming back to this, and I haven't made up my mind about it. I keep feeling like there's got to be something that is like being missed here. I mean, or there's something screwy about both of the answers, both the 1/2 and the 1/3 answer. But this is a real tough one. I'll make a video about this at some point because I find this a lot of fun. It's kind of like the opposite of Newcomb's problem for me, in the sense that in the case of Newcomb's problem, like, obviously you should one box. That is obviously the correct answer, right? It is crazy that two boxes exist. So people tend to split halfway on Newcomb's problem. But in Newcomb's problem, I've got a very, very clear view. In this particular case, right, I just constantly vacillate, and I really have no idea. And it's like both of them, the arguments in both cases seem right, like I really get the paradox on a gut level. Whereas I think, like, with something like Newcomb's problem, you're just crazy if you're a two boxer. With this one, I get the problem. Okay. Extended mind, yes or no? Yeah, I think no facts the matter. It's just a case of, like, what would be the most useful way of modelling the organism in question. Well-being. So I'm inclined to accept a hedonistic view here. I mean, I don't really have much to say about it. It's not like if you have some other account of well-being, fine. But I guess hedonism or experientialism has always struck me as the obvious answer, and I don't think any of the arguments against it are convincing. The experience machine, right? The experience machine is a classic argument against hedonism, and I just don't share the intuition that argument is trying to get at, right? Because Nozick wants us to say, well, we wouldn't get into the experience machine, so there must be something you value other than pleasure. But obviously, I would get into the experience machine. I'm inclined towards hedonism or experientialism. Experientialism at least. I'm not sure I would say that it's just pleasure that matters, but I think well-being ultimately does just consist in positive experiences, broadly speaking. True contradictions. I'm inclined to think that these are actual, but I think they arise as kind of quirks of language, or I think J.C. Beale, as he puts it, they're spandrels of truth, right? Like, once you get a language which has sufficient expressive power, so once you have a language which has a truth predicate and which is capable of, like, the construction of self-referential sentences, sentences that refer to themselves, once you have that machinery in place, right, you're just going to generate true contradictions, like, as a kind of byproduct of it. The idea that there might be, like, true contradictions existing metaphysically in the world, I think is very, very weird. I'm not really sure how to make sense of that, because truth is just a property of propositions. So I guess that there might be propositions that describe the world where we would be inclined to say that they're both true and false, but I can't think of any examples of that. Whereas there are these little linguistic tricks, linguistic paradoxes, where I'm quite happy to just say that they're true contradictions, and the contradiction here just is a product of, as I say, the expressive power of our language. It's a spandrel. It's a byproduct of that. That's what I'm inclined to say anyway. Arguments for theism. Which is the strongest? I don't know, because I don't think any of them are any good at all. I think they're all terrible arguments, and they're just not remotely convincing to me. And I admit that part of that is a product of my general philosophical orientation, right? Like, as I have said, I'm an empiricist, and So, if you are somebody who is more inclined to engage in speculative metaphysics, if you are somebody who finds inference to the best explanation to be a useful tool for coming to metaphysical conclusions, well, I can kind of see, all right, like maybe you would be persuaded by some of these arguments. I mean, so modern design argument, the fine-tuning argument. Like, maybe you're going to come to the conclusion that God exists. Maybe that would be the best explanation for fine-tuning. I don't know, though, because even in that case, like, there are other explanations available, right? Like the multiverse. I mean, how can you rule that out? I don't. That seems like a perfectly fine explanation, right? If the universe is fine-tuned and we want to explain it via some metaphysical hypothesis, the multiverse is perfectly straightforward. So I don't know. But look, yeah, I don't find any of these arguments at all convincing. Maybe if you have a different kind of philosophical perspective, let's say epistemological perspective, some of them might be a bit more convincing. But yeah, I can't say that any of these are strong. I do think that the ontological argument is the most entertaining. So that's the most brazen. So the ontological argument is my favourite because it's kind of ballsy, right? It's it's bold, and the idea that we can we can basically just define God into existence. I mean, that's really what we're trying to do. In any version of the ontological argument, that's really what it comes down to, is that we're just going to define this thing into existence. That's such a remarkable move. I love the ontological argument. It's a lot of fun. It's a bullshit argument, but it is fun. But that one, I suppose, is my favourite. But I don't know. I'm trying to think of something positive to say about them, but I just think they're all really shit arguments. So I can't say anything positive about them. Okay, let's move on. Practical reason. I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with this issue. Consciousness. Well, I've already explained. It could be anything. Could extend to rocks, or maybe it's very restricted. I don't know. Interlevel metaphysics. Well, I've already expressed what I think of metaphysics. Quantum mechanics. I'm an anti-realist. So, obviously, I am just agnostic about this. Morality. Well, I'm an expressivist because, as I have mentioned earlier, I am a non-cognitivist. So, yeah, I'm a type of expressivist. It seems a bit strange to me that we have this question on morality, right? But then we've also got this question. So this is morality, right? Naturalist, realism, non-naturalism, expressivism, error theory, or constructivism, right? So we've got that. But then we had the earlier question on moral judgment, where it's cognitivism or non-cognitivism. But error theory, non-naturalism, naturalist, realism, constructivism, those are cognitivist positions. It's just odd that we've got two different questions which seem to be about the same thing, but they're just using different categories. I don't know. I feel like I'm missing something here. I'm pretty familiar with meta-ethics. Like, I know meta-ethics. I've got lots of videos on meta-ethics. I've studied meta-ethics a lot. And this question threw me because I'm like, wait a minute, is this something different? I mean, are we saying that error theory is like something different from cognitivism? Because I thought error theory was just a form of cognitivism. It's a bit odd. But okay. Moral principles. Yeah, I'm insufficiently familiar. So that's it. Those are the 100 questions in the new philpapers survey, and those were my answers. I hope that was at least somewhat coherent and interesting. But if not, never mind. Goodbye.